Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name's David Sequeira. I'm the director of the Margaret Lawrence Gallery at the Faculty of Fine Arts and Music. And it really is my great honour to welcome you to this special event presented by the Melbourne Reconciliation Network. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm located, and I invite you to do the same. I acknowledge that the land that I'm situated on, the land of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people of the Greater Kulin Nation, was a land that for many generations before us hosted the making of art, dance, the sharing of knowledge, the telling of stories, and that these rituals continue today. And it really is with great joy and honour that I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. Our guest today, Tony Birch, is a founding member of the Melbourne School of Discontent and a Fitzroy Blak. He has published 3 novels, the best-selling The White Girl, winner of the 2020 New South Wales Premier's Award for Indigenous Writing, and shortlisted for the 2020 Miles Franklin Literary Prize. Ghost River, winner of the 2016 Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Indigenous Writing, and Blood, which was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award in 2012. He's also the author of Shadowboxing and 3 short story collections, Father's Day, The Promise and Common People. In 2017, he was awarded the Patrick White Literary Award. And in 2021, he has 2 new books, a poetry collection, Whisper Songs, and a new short story collection, Dark as Last Night. Now, when I invited Tony to speak today, I asked him if he would make a selection of texts with Reconciliation Week in mind. And we're very lucky. He's chosen a selection from his essay, 2 Fires, an excerpt from his new book, Dark as Last Night, and 2 poems from a new poetry collection called Whisper Songs. And the way that today's session will work is that Tony will read a selection and then I'll ask him a question or 2. And if we have time at the end of the session, we'll be able to take some questions from the Zoom audience. So without further ado, Tony, if you could introduce Christmas Hills from 2 Fires, just tell us a little bit about the context for this and then read that selection, please.
Yes, thank you, David. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. I think we've got about 280 people in the room, so it's a very crowded room. I also firstly want to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people, the Wurundjeri Nation. So I'm on Wurundjeri land here in Carlton, and it's a great privilege as always to speak on the traditional land of the Wurundjeri people. This first essay or this first excerpt is also from a longer essay called 2 Fires. The longer essay is an essay which reflects on my experiences of both attending a festival here in Victoria, a festival at Christmas Hills after the devastation of the Black Saturday bushfires, but it's also an essay that engages with a trip I made to Turtle Island, otherwise known as Canada. And I think that this essay epitomizes for me what it is to genuinely think about a notion of reconciliation that is something other than a bureaucratic notion and something that does a lot better than think about a quote on a Hallmark greeting card. So I'll read the Christmas Hills section and of course deal with any questions that David has. From outside, the building resembled a glorified tin shed. I was surprised to see so many people milling about. Inside the hall, I was warmly greeted by one of the organisers who escorted me into a second larger space where we writers were to perform for the day. The room was crowded and the overflowing audience were chatting and laughing together like old friends, which many of them were. A window on one side of the room looked out across a luscious green valley to lightly treed hills in the distance. The morning sun rested against an expansive window. Every available seat in the hall had been taken and more audience members were seated on a scruffy carpet in front of the stage. Still more people crammed in doorways and stood along the back wall, One of the organisers of the event would tell me later that the committee had initially catered for 75 people, hoping 50 people might buy a ticket. But as the publicity for the day spread, the catering numbers were increased to 100 and then 150. In the end, more than 200 people turned up for the event and the kitchen ran out of baked scones. The room was charged with energy. It sparkled and cracked. It felt magical. I'd been invited to the Christmas Hills Book and Writing Festival months earlier and accepted the invitation with little more than a thought for my hectic schedule. The week prior to the festival was madness. I'd given 2 public lectures on climate change, led a community writing workshop, and was dealing with a mild family drama at home, not unusual for a parent of 5 children and a member of an extended family that would require an annual census if numbers were to be accurately documented. My lack of enthusiasm for the looming festival was driven by general weariness and more drastically a realisation that the day would clash with an important football game, and my team, Carlton, were playing that afternoon at the MCG. I thought about pulling out of the event, faking an injury, so to speak, until Sarah, sitting across the kitchen table, berated me, reminding me that I had made a commitment to people. It's important that you keep your promise, she said, raising an eyebrow. You're going and you'll enjoy it. Okay, I nodded like a petulant child. So can you drive me? No, I can't, she smiled. I've had a busy week and I need a rest. The drive from my home to Christmas Hills takes around an hour. Unfortunately, I don't have a driver's license and the hills can't be easily accessed by public transport. I thought about a second approach to my wife begging to be chauffeured. And then I remembered that a former writing student of mine, Alice, had put a note on Facebook that she'd be heading up for the festival. She had grown up in Christmas Hills and was excited about a writers' festival coming to her hometown. I opened my computer and sent her a message asking for a lift. She responded within minutes and collected me from my front gate early the following morning. Alice had been a wonderful student, typical of the better writers in my classes. She was generally quiet in seminars but produced great work. I was aware that she'd continue writing after leaving university and was beginning to publish short stories and essays. During the drive, we talked mostly about writing until I asked her about growing up so far away from the city. Towards the end of the conversation, she told me that her childhood home had burnt down in the fires. The family could have lost their own lives, Alice said, commenting that it had been a difficult decision for her father to evacuate the home rather than stay behind and try and protect it. The Black Saturday bushfires of February 2009 to the north of the city of Melbourne destroyed more than 2,000 homes and 173 people died. The fires occurred toward the end of a very dry summer. In the week leading up to the disaster, the temperature reached the low 40s over several consecutive days, and on the day of the fires, the temperature hit 46 degrees. So ferocious was the heat that self-combusting fireballs exploded in the sky, and homes that were rated fire safe were destroyed within minutes. Many families remained homeless months after the Black Saturday, and years later, the deep trauma suffered by thousands of people remains, often as scars of anguish across the faces of those who lost loved ones, their homes and possessions. A close friend of mine lost their homes too. Chris, a builder philosopher, had gathered a remarkable library of books over the years, some of them rare items. He'd read them all, as I would often discover whenever he worked on my house. While laying tiles or hanging plasterboard, he'd tutor me on subjects as diverse as Roman history and human anatomy. His home was at Flowerdale, a small village that would become the epicenter of the fire. The home ignited as Chris was escaping the carnage, racing along a country laneway in his work van. His wife, seated next to him, nursed their newborn daughter, Indigo. Chris would tell me later, still in shock, that all he could see out of the car windscreen were exploding eucalypt trees. A week after the fire, I drove with Chris along the ridge, heading towards whatever might remain of his home. It was a clear and cool morning. Everything around us had been reduced to stumps of charcoal or the skeletal remains of houses, trees, farm sheds, and machinery. The still smouldering ground was littered with the blackened and bloated bodies of farm animals. We turned into his street and searched for his house. It had disappeared along with every object it had ever held: furniture, paintings, keepsakes, and his precious books. The lasting image I have of that morning is of my dear friend kneeling in the earth, sifting delicate wisps of paper, the remains of his library, through his fingertips. Another friend of ours who lost his home in the fire was Patrick Wolfe, the internationally renowned historian of colonisation. Wolfe was something of an outsider, a great intellect, and also a bit of a rogue. His defining statement, "Colonialism is a structure rather than an event," has been etched into the minds of scholars around the world. He was a generous soul. Each time I published a book of fiction, he would send me an appreciative email followed by a celebratory lunch. In late 2015, we had talked about my most recent novel, Ghost River, and the following week we each gave academic papers at an anthropology conference at Melbourne University. 2 months later, Patrick was dead as a result of unforeseen complications after a short illness. 6 months further on, at Christmas Hills, not far from the new house Patrick had built on the same land that had taken his old home, I would smell wood and smoke in my nostrils and think of him again.
Thanks, Tony. I want to talk about Patrick Wolfe and the way that you write about him, because you write about him within the context of the Black Saturday bushfires of 2009. And I wonder whether there is any connection between the symbolism of the fires and Wolfe's defining statement, colonialism is not a structure, is a structure, not an event. Could you talk about that a little?
Yeah, I could. I think there are several ways to put this into context. I think firstly, in relationship to Patrick, Patrick was an Englishman, so he's the ultimate colonial figure in some ways. He'd come out to Australia as an adult. And what I admired about Patrick was not only his ability, but his willingness to engage directly with Aboriginal people, having conversations that initially could be adversarial, could be quite tense, the difficult conversations that Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people sometimes need to have. And he understood the need for those conversations. And what I think admired about him most is that there would have been Aboriginal people who were initially skeptical of Patrick, or probably even oppositional to another white man engaging with Aboriginal culture and history. But I think over many, many years, he became a person who really became a friend of mine, a friend of many other Aboriginal people, because we understood his honesty, his tenacity to accept those difficult conversations, and incredible intellect. I mean, he was an incredibly intellectual person, but with none of the snobbery that often goes with being a white historian of so-called Aboriginal life and culture. He never felt that in any way he was in possession of our story. And in fact, to his credit, Patrick Wolfe was someone who was an early teacher in a course at Melbourne University called Koori and Non-Koori History, which became a course that I taught called Aboriginal History. And unlike many other people, Patrick actually stepped away from a position in that course to ensure that an Aboriginal person would be employed. He was also a great friend of Auntie Joy Murphy, a very important Wurundjeri woman up in the area that I write about in this essay, so that he had a lot of friends in our community. The other reason that I put him in this story, and I don't want to go on about it too much, is this essay, if you get to read it, by the way, anyone who wants to read the Two Fires essay can download it from Meanjin, the magazine. It's available on Google. A little while after this event, I went to Canada. I went on a very, very long hike into the mountains and found myself in a small tea house on an afternoon, and I sat next to 3 young Americans, and I struck up a conversation with one of the young people, a young guy, and I'll talk about the importance of that. And when we got to talking about what I was doing, he said, oh, do you know Patrick Wolfe? And he was reading Patrick's book. And yeah, this is on the other side of the world, and this amazing symmetry. And the reason I say that is that one of the things I believe in is that it's really important to engage with strangers. It's actually really important to begin conversations with people you don't know and to see where those conversations may go. So for me, politically, this is important to engage with people, because when I sat down at that table, I was really tired from a long hike and I didn't really feel like talking. But the fact that I turned to this kid and introduced myself, the richness that came out of that conversation was one of the most emotional moments of my life. In fact, it was very emotional. So for me, it's very much about thinking about what are the opportunities in dialogue, what are the opportunities for conversation. So that was at the heart of the essay and at the heart of my friendship with Patrick. And why that relates back to the Christmas Hill section of the essay, David, is that day I felt a very similar sense of potential. So real potential for people to engage with each other. The fact that the community who had asked us to perform that day, so to engage several Aboriginal writers, they did so not because they were looking for pity, or not because they were saying, look what happened to us, it's terrible. They invited us on the basis of saying, Aboriginal people who have had so much stolen and taken from them, you have a lot to teach us about rejuvenation, because you're such a community of great vitality. So on the basis of that generosity, the day was a great success. I have lamented since then, if I could run the country and just have that people in that room as my cabinet, we could solve a few problems. But once you step out of that, that energetic environment and you're back in the world of recalcitrant, ignorant politicians, it's very hard to make headway.
Mm. And just on that day, I mean, tell me about writers' festivals. Is this, are they important to you? How important is it for a writer to speak about their work? Who comes to these things? Like, just, how important is that kind of engagement with readers?
Well, I think, David, one of the things I'd have to say is that it's a very, I'm not saying this doesn't happen generally, but for Aboriginal writers, it's a little bit cautionary, because when you go to a festival to talk about your work, there is a tendency where people want you to talk about everything. And that could be anything from land rights to native title to issues that have nothing to do with your work. And we have to be really careful to not be perceived or allow ourselves to be perceived as experts or leaders. So in my case, I try to ensure that I talk about what I know, in the sense of, particularly in relationship to the fiction. And if I'm asked questions outside my understanding or what we might call my authority or knowledge, I certainly wouldn't be rude to a questioner, but I try to direct them to Aboriginal people who have far greater knowledge than I do. Just by coincidence, I was watching The Drum last night, and there was an Aboriginal woman talking about the removal of children and the need to keep Aboriginal children safe from the clutches of welfare authorities, which is still a major problem. And when I was listening to her talk, I was thinking she had wonderful experience, but also really great expertise. And it's one of those instances where, when people want to inquire and ask about why there's so many Aboriginal kids being incarcerated still, why there's so many Aboriginal kids still being taken from family, we need to ensure that those sorts of voices with the authority and the expertise speak, and not us. And also, of course, in relationship to greater history issues, to obviously defer to older Aboriginal people, even than myself, although as far as an Aboriginal person goes, I'm pretty old, who have much greater depth of knowledge. So I've worked in the climate justice area for the last 6 or 7 years, and there's certain stuff I know pretty well, But even still, if I was, say, talking on Wurundjeri country and people start to talk about Wurundjeri deep time knowledge of place, it's important that they speak to a Wurundjeri person with authority. So just to put that aside, that's important. But I'd say generally, David, I actually enjoy writers' festivals. One of the changes in festivals in recent years is that you meet a lot of Aboriginal people at writers' festivals as, you know, like a travelling band of sort of troublemakers, and there's usually at least half a dozen other blackfella and blackfella women writing. So I was at the Sydney Writers' Festival earlier at the end of April. And so Nayuka Gorey, who's a deadly young woman, her mum, Ronnie Gorey, Evelyn Arulin, many other Aboriginal people, Anita Heiss, who I interviewed in Sydney. You get to meet up and catch up with a lot of other writers in your community, so that's great. And the other thing is that, to be honest, I think that people who come to your events, whether they pay, some events are free, some are paid. I think people here, I'm saying audience, they give up their day to come and listen to a writer. I try to be very professional in those circumstances and ensure that audiences get what they came from. That is to hear a writer talk in an engaging way about your work. And I think that's part of the brief. It's part of the reality of, when you have a book out, working with your publisher. And I think that not only they're necessary, they are really, I think, enjoyable. Just as I said, to finish on the question, for us as writers, is that we don't know everything. We shouldn't claim to know everything. And it's not a problem as a writer to say to a questioner, I'm sorry, but that's not my area. But if I can be helpful to say, look, here's an Aboriginal woman I know who works in this area. Yeah, she could be someone who you want to talk to. Having said that, the problem with that is that Aboriginal people are always being asked to talk to people, so we're all really busy. So when I say maybe you want to contact this person, that person probably thinks, oh, don't do this to me, Tony, because it means I'm going to get another 10 emails. But that's just the reality.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Now, before we move on to the next text, I just want to come back to Wolfe's statement itself. Colonialism is a structure, not an event.
Yeah.
Is that something that's guided you or something that's impacted you, that statement? Or were you kind of onto that before you read that with Patrick?
I think here, I think you're making a really important point about how we think, is that I would say that what happens when you read something like that, if this sounds that it's not complimentary, let me explain. It becomes so obvious when you hear it. It's like a light bulb moment. So a lot of stuff you've been thinking about and carrying and trying to piece together, when something so simple in the sense of these few words, you read on a page, it goes bang. It's the clarity of his statement. So I don't think Patrick would say, yeah, that was a statement of total originality. It was a statement that encompassed a lot of what many of us were thinking, but were unable to articulate in a direct way. So in that sense, it's absolutely vital in your growth, your knowledge, because it's almost like it ties an idea up for you. The cautionary note with that, and Patrick and we would think about this, is it can't then become just a soundbite. It can't just become just a banner. It's got to have idea behind it. And what he means by that is that, he goes on when he gives that definition, the all-encompassing structure of colonisation in a place like Australia. It's about land, it's about theft of children, it's about genocide, it's about massacre, it's about the capitalist economy to run single crop farms, et cetera, et cetera. So, and not only that, of course, it's a global structure. One of the things that Patrick did very well was look at global structures of colonialism from, I think he's working strongly from the 18th century onwards. So my area of climate justice and climate knowledge, I wouldn't even conceive of thinking about the impact on Aboriginal land in Australia and Indigenous land globally, that negative impact, without thinking about something like global capitalism and global colonialism from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So those global structures are structures that link up all sorts of devastations on Indigenous land across the planet for the last 500 years.
Well, thank you so much. I want to move on to Dark as Last Night. And I'm just wondering, without giving away too much, can you tell us a little bit about Dark as Last Night?
Well, I can. It's my book, so I can tell you many things about it. Firstly, what I can tell you is two things. One is the title, Dark as Last Night. I was very fortunate. A wonderful poet, Annie Tafew, who lives in New South Wales. She's also a remarkable artist, and she works at an incredible organisation called Red Room Poetry that some people will know. She published a poem of the same name, Dark as Last Night, and both those 4 words in that poem had an incredible impact on what I was doing with this manuscript when I was putting it together. And fortunately, I was allowed to use the title. I asked Annie if I could use it, so I'm really indebted to her. The other thing is that this cover of this book and the cover of the poetry book, Whisper Songs, are designed by a Larrakia woman, a remarkable artist, Jenna Lee, who's an Aboriginal woman who I've been fortunate to work with on 3 books now. The collection itself is a brand new collection that is not out yet. So this is a scoop to get this today. And it's a collection coming out in August. And the story itself is about a young girl faced with the reality of living in a very violent house with a very violent father, and a friendship that she begins with an older woman living next door, but also a desperate need to try and find a way for her mother to escape the clutches of this violent man. And the scene that we'll read is that this girl has run to the police station to get the police to her house after knowing that her mother has been assaulted on a very rainy and dark night. I heard my father's footsteps in the hallway, familiar yet somehow uncertain. He opened the door. He'd stripped to his singlet and shorts. His permanently oiled hair was a mess. The anger on his face, looking down at me, was obvious. What, he growled at the giant policeman, his chest lifting. Is this your daughter? The policeman asked. She is. My father reached across the doorway and grabbed me by the arm. Where have you been, Rose? Get inside. He pulled me into the hallway and tried shutting the door. The policeman wasn't having it. He planted a boot in the doorway. Your name, sir? My name? The anger in my father's voice was calculated to scare the officer away, a game of bullying and bluff that suited him. Yes, I need your name. I also need to know what's happened here in your home tonight. I believe that your wife has been injured, that there has been an incident. I looked up at the policeman. For just a moment, I thought he might be a hero. My name's Freddie Taylor, and there's been no incident here, not in my house. My father glared at the policeman. The rain had not stopped falling. Water rushed along the bluestone gutter in front of the house. The policeman remained calm and put a hand on the front door. I need to come inside, Mr. Taylor, and speak to your wife personally. There's no need for that, my father said, pushing me lightly in the back toward the kitchen. I'll decide that, not you, the policeman said. He forced his way past my father, who followed him into the kitchen, calling anxiously, You don't need to speak with her. She has nothing to say to the police. The earlier carnage had been swept away and the floor was washed clean. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table, a bloody towel pressed to the side of her face. Her free hand resting on her knee was shaking furiously. My father's trouser belt lay on the table. The brass buckle he regularly polished gleamed under the bare light bulb above the kitchen table. Mrs. Taylor, the policeman asked. If she heard what he said, it didn't seem to register with her. My mother looked at me with such fear on her face that I understood in that instant it had been a mistake to take the advice of Little Red and run to the police station for help. You've obviously been hurt, Mrs. Taylor. I need to look at your injury. The policeman kneeled beside Mum and took the towel away from her face, exposing the gash on her cheek. The bleeding had eased, but the cut was ugly. You'll need to go to the hospital and have that seen to, he said. It'll need stitching. He looked over his shoulder at my father, who was standing with his hands on his hips, staring with menace at my mother. The policeman stood up. He towered above my father. I need to know what's happened here tonight. the whole story. None of us spoke. My mother's foot nervously tapped the floor. She eventually broke our complicit silence. It was me, she said. I had an accident. An accident, the policeman said, shaking his head. I could see he'd immediately resigned himself to a performance that he was familiar with. It was me, she repeated. I was working here in the kitchen and the floor was wet, and after I'd mopped it, I slipped and hit my face on the corner of the table. The policeman examined the rounded edge of the kitchen table and turned to my father. What do you have to say, Mr. Taylor? My father actually smiled. What can I say? My wife's clumsy. She's always been, haven't you, love? He walked over to my mother and rested a hand in the centre of her back. She grimaced. You're right, officer, he said. I'd best get her to the hospital and have her taken care of. He retrieved his shirt from the back of the kitchen chair and slipped it on. I'll show you out. We'll need to get going. The policeman looked around the room. His eyes settled on a wedding photograph of my parents framed on a wall. My mother was wearing a white gown that she'd hastily borrowed from a friend. My father, sporting a dark pinstripe suit, had already faded into the background. You're about to have another child, the policeman asked. Yes, she said, soon. Well, you can't afford accidents like this, as you call it, and endanger your baby's life. He turned to my father. Your wife needs to be taken care of. And she will be, my father answered, buttoning his shirt. She will be. I'll show you out. Don't bother, I'll show myself out. My father didn't take Mum to the hospital that night. He washed and dressed the cut before explaining in a perfectly calm voice, you'll be fine. This scratch will look after itself. Later that night, my father came into the bedroom and woke me. Rose, come into the kitchen. He marched me along the hallway, sat me at the kitchen table and quietly explained that we did not go to the police or anybody else we might think of. We did not open our mouths to strangers about our private business, family business, he stressed. The drunkenness and anger from earlier in the night had left him. My father had returned to a state of precision and order. He stroked my cheek. Do you understand me, Rose? I refused to answer. My defiance was obvious. He picked his trouser belt up from the table, slowly ran the leather strap through his hand and fondled the brass buckle. Do you understand? He asked again. I won't ask another time. I looked down at the belt buckle. He'd hit me with it before, erratically, drunkenly, without reason. I knew my father well enough to be certain that regardless of any answer I provided, the onslaught could not be avoided. The pair of us, we both knew that. My mother lying awake in fear in the front room, she knew that. My little brother Sean, a month away from life, he already knew that. Our next door neighbour, Little Red, she knew, as did the giant policeman. We all knew. Our family secret was everyone's secret. It had started raining again, the heavy drops beating on the kitchen roof. I remembered the words of my grandmother, dead 2 years, that rain on a roof is the song of a loving home. Well, not our home. Take your pajamas off, my father ordered. I stripped to my underwear and turned away from him, just as my mother had. Look at me, Rose, he said. You must look at me. I'm your father. I did look at him. I was 9 years old, 10 at Christmas. I was as skinny as a rake and I was his daughter. In that moment, I understood that our relationship was about to change. From that night onward, I would always refuse him.
Wow. There's such an overwhelming patriarchal dominance described in that excerpt. And well, for me, it's not just about the physical violence. It's the use of aggression and threat as a way of silencing the voices of, the young girl and the woman. And I wonder if you would be willing to share a little bit about that, about the notion of silencing voices through violence.
Yeah, well, I suppose if anyone knows my work, the story is very much returned to one of the themes in my first book, Shadowboxing, which is now 15 years old. The change in some ways is the voice or the child is a girl. I think that reflects two things to say at the outset, is that I think that when I wrote about violence or domestic violence in my first book, even though it was through the eyes of a young boy, it also reflected the experiences of girls in my life. So that, yeah, to be honest, that first book was very autobiographical. And although this story is not autobiographical, the themes of violence in the book, and as you talk about patriarchal violence, are very familiar and are very autobiographical. And I think also with this book that since I wrote the last book, my four daughters are now grown, so they're all adults, and I have a granddaughter, Isabel, and two grandsons, Archie and Charlie. I've not only reflected on my daughters' lives as children, but their lives of adults and becoming parents, two of them anyway. And I think that one of the ideas I've returned to this is that I'm both now, as an older person, even more shocked at the ability to survive that level of violence. I think that I couldn't comprehend it as a child because it was so normalized. And when I think of my grandchildren who never experienced violence in their lives, I can't even countenance what would happen to them if they were faced with such violence. It seems incomprehensible. But the reason I say that in this story, I agree with you that the violence of the father, he's such a menacing figure in this story. I mean, he's a monster. There's no doubt about that. But there is a resilience not in the mother, and that's not a negative judgment. She's been really psychologically as well as physically almost destroyed by her husband. But there is incredible resilience in the child. So when you read the story as a whole, Rose is a girl. Yeah, you really love this girl. She's quite determined. And when you read the collection as a whole, and not by any sort of didactic approach, there are several stories with young girls, sort of 10 to 14 years old, as protagonists who are equally determined and equally strong. And I think that's not something that I tried overtly to do. It's just something that's coming through in my work more. And I suppose, David, the last thing I'd say about that, it's the gratitude that I must express as a writer, that the fact is that the demands of women and young women, older women in the last few years to demand to call out issues of domestic violence and sexual and physical abuse in Australia and globally, it does have an impact on you. And in a sense, for me, it's not like I feel a demand to address these issues from my childhood, but I think that courage of women to confront violence in all its manifestations is something that it clearly starts to affect your psyche, and I hope that the way that I've responded to that call is that it's had a positive impact on my work. So I think it's both my personal experience and what is happening around us in the contemporary sense, that we've got to name this for what it is. And the stories we tell about violence sometimes can be quite confronting, and sometimes that's necessary. So in this story, I think that it is a tough story in some ways, but one that I have to say that I was very pleased with when I finished it, and I'm very pleased that it's the title story of the book.
Thank you. I want to move to the two poems that you selected from Whisper Songs, which is such an extraordinary collection of works. Like, for me, it's like this album of snapshots, like small grabs of images, I don't know, to do with memory or history and love, ideas, and of course the sort of reverberations of colonization. I wonder if you could share Waiting for the Train with Thelma Plum with us, and we'll have a conversation after that.
Yeah, so this is Waiting for a Train with Thelma Plum, and just to even worship at the feet of Thelma even more, the last story of Darko's Last Night, the story collection, is Riding Trains with Thelma Plum. So in the second instance, we actually get on the train. So it's Waiting for a Train with Thelma Plum. Penrith Station sits broken, a grieving heart in pieces. The platform a way station for essential workers living dead days of isolation. We have little time for each other, envying those slumbering at home. Flannelette pajama, sleep-ins, raisin toast and hot Milo, lazily fucking the days away, Netflix and Zoom peering on. We slouch, beaten, except for a girl in black. Kiss of life in black boots, black jeans and hoodie, black, red, yellow flag on her back, headphones soon to pounce. She moves, raises an arm, Finch cleft. Hey, hey, fuck that.
Well, when you sent this work through in the selection, I was so excited because I have a Thelma Plum playlist on my phone, and could you just tell us about this poem? Where did it come from? The title, and unpack this a little bit for us.
Well, it's literal in the sense that I was on Penrith Station, which is a place I probably not that keen to visit again. And I was waiting for a train to go into Central in Sydney, and it was during the sort of fears over lockdown, there'd been this little window of opportunity where I'd been fortunate to go to New South Wales, and we were in a situation of flux of what was going to happen. And I was on the railway station, and no one looked happy, except for this one young woman who, an Aboriginal woman, in her hoodie with the flag, and she had these headphones, and she was literally in her own world, and she was dancing up and down the platform. Well, not quite dancing, but certainly giving it a go. And I don't know what she was listening to, by the way. So my poetic license to use the term is that I wondered who would she listen to that would give her so much sassiness and so much front. Yeah, she you could just tell this girl would take no prisoners. And I was thinking of Thelma Plum's song, which I'd just been hearing, "I'm Better in Black," and I just thought it's got to be Thelma Plum. So I ran with that idea and produced the poem. And then I wrote a story, and the story actually is on the train, so I take the story even further. And I was very lucky to hear recently that Thelma Plum, she certainly has both the poetry collection and the book, and she's, I think, really enjoyed that. And I have it on good authority from one of my daughters, Grace, who runs my Instagram account, that she claims that Thelma Plum is following me on Instagram. So if that's true, I'll take that to my grave with great happiness.
Of course, of course. In all of the works that you've chosen so far, you create such a rich, potent sense of place. Like in Christmas Hills, it's evident in the charred landscape that's still smouldering a week after the fires. And in Dark as Last Night, it's evident in the sort of psychological intensity of the kitchen. And in Waiting for the Train with Thelma Plum, you paint this picture of Penrith Station that's almost like a tired and worn stage set. Mm-hmm. Why is creating a sense of place so important in your work? Well, firstly, is it important? And if so, why?
Well, I mean, it's obviously really important to my work. I mean, in all of the work that I range across, there will be really important issues which are about Aboriginal country and Aboriginal place in a story sometimes, so that in a story like Christmas Hills, it's the places of that story, which I talked about, Wurundjeri country around that Christmas Hills area, and the section that's on Turtle Island. That's a Seven Nations Treaty group, First Nations people on Turtle Island. It's probably important to say here, David, there's a great important moment for me in that essay where I was feeling quite distraught on that trip. And people will know in the last week or so, there's been horrific coverage of the story of the recovery of hundreds of bodies of First Nations children who were held in the so-called residential schools in Canada, of the idea of these children dying and their identities not being known. When I was there, the two things that were preoccupying me was, one, that there was a lot of coverage of the residential schools abuses, and the Royal Commission into the murder of Aboriginal women and girls in Canada was getting a lot of coverage. And I felt really distraught, partly because of the enormous comparisons to what has happened, the violence here in Australia. And I was walking along a place called Bow River outside Banff one night, and I suddenly realized that rather than think about what country am I in, as in European country called Canada, whose country am I on? Whose First Nations country am I on? And once I asked myself that question, that became the focal point of why I was there. I'd forgotten about the fact that I'm on First Nations country. I'm not in Canada. I'm on First Nations country, and that rejuvenated me and to think responsibly about those terrible issues. So in that sense, country is absolutely vital. As a fiction writer, of course, the other issue that you're alluding to, whether it be a railway station, a kitchen in the inner city in the 60s or today, is that I regard any place that my work takes place as absolutely vital to the story. So rather than think about places, characteristics of story, to think about places, character. So in the story, Dark as Last Night, a lot of the action takes place in a kitchen, in a domestic space. And I write a lot about kitchens. If anyone has read my book, The White Girl, the kitchen, Odette Brown's kitchen, where her and Sissy enjoy eating, is a beautiful domestic space. It's a place of love. And of course, in Dark as Last Night, the kitchen in that house and the kitchen in the house that I wrote about in Shadowboxing, these are the places of great menace because, you know, domestic violence, domestic space. This is the horrible crime of what happens behind, you know, front doors of houses. So that I'm interested in the impact that places have on us and the impact of us on those places, because there is that intertwined relationship. So when I taught creative writing, which I did for many years at Melbourne University, I used to impress upon my students as often as I could that, yeah, your writing, your story doesn't take place, you know, in front of blue screen, you know, where you just insert an image later. It's a real three-dimensional place. So to think of your work in some way theatrically, as if it was happening on a stage. And I used to always say to students, imagine that your work is a stage play. When that curtain opens, what does the audience see? They see a three-dimensional space, not a flat screen. So you have to always be thinking about your story in a three-dimensional way, whether that be physical movement of people, the atmosphere, sound. So yeah, it is very important to me. And I think all of my writing does that. The only complaint I ever get from people is my people walk too much. They go to too many places. So I find it hard to keep people still, which is a bit like me.
Well, we come to the last of your selected works, which is Hygiene for a Nation's Soul. And I wonder if you could read this poem and then tell us a little bit about why you chose it for this particular event. Like, this is the last day of Reconciliation Week, and you know, you made this selection for this event. So over to you.
Okay, so the poem is Hygiene for a Nation's Soul. At water's edge, cleanse myself in your image. Scoured this body, masked an eye, bowed to blindness. Came up shadow, dancing hollow, stolen land. Bleached a soul, hammered hands and blackened feet, gouged an eye for your inspection. Now, that is actually the oldest poem in the book. It was a poem that was published as part of a series of posters for the protest against the 2006 Commonwealth Games that were held in Melbourne. So it was what we know as the Camp Sovereignty protest in the King's Domain, and a series of Aboriginal people, writers and artists produced these poems. The reason I wrote it at the time and the reason I've chosen it today is that I suppose for me, it's a sober reminder that, one, there is still so much work to be done by non-Aboriginal Australia if reconciliation ever is to be possible. I think sometimes you hear people talk about, yeah, this is something that work needs to be done on both sides and we need to come together. Obviously, ultimately, we do hope to come together, but the work, in fact, doesn't. The work has to be done by non-Aboriginal people, and non-Aboriginal people have a lot of work to do. And I think, to be honest, that there are people who are really engaged with that idea, obviously, as you are, David, asking me to join you today. So I'll take that as an act of great faith. but of course there are people who still refuse. And when this poem is about us having to almost open up our bodies to give every aspect of who we are over to the colonial authority to do with us as they will. And I think historically in the post-invasion period in Australia, Aboriginal people and our bodies have been treated as playthings, as objects for non-Aboriginal Australia. One of the things that when I taught Aboriginal history, I used to say to my students is that what often makes non-Aboriginal people so anxious about Aboriginal people is that when we define our own identity, we define our own sense of place, we define our own attachment to country. And the mentality of colonialism is that, in fact, is the opposite. The colonial authority wants to control the Aboriginal body, the Aboriginal psyche, and the Aboriginal story in every way possible. And self-determination is so confronting in that sense. So just to say, I will determine who I am, I will determine what country I'm from and how I relate to the world, that autonomy and that sense of what I would call sovereignty, that is true sovereignty, when you defy colonial attempts to control you, that creates enormous anxiety in non-Aboriginal people, even those who think they are friends of the Aborigine. So that's why I chose it. And I suppose that for me, David, I'm neither an optimist or a pessimist. I just keep going, keep doing what I can do. And I think that in regards that I chose it today in regard to reconciliation, I wasn't joking before when I said it's got to be something other than a Hallmark greeting card. Of course, we want people to have better relationships. Of course, we want to improve relationships between non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal people. We want our children to be safe. We want our children to be with loved ones and family. We don't want our loved ones dying in prisons and police cells. And this is a shocking crime that not only has continued in Australia since the so-called reconciliation marches of the year 2000, it's actually become worse. So the incarceration rates of young people are higher. Deaths in custody continue to be a terrible crime. So that my view is that I want this country to change. I desperately want this country to change, but it won't change unless all of us are prepared to work hard. And I think what people need to understand, non-Aboriginal Australia needs to understand, is that people have to be prepared to do the heavy lifting that hasn't been done in the past. And so I'm energized by people who do that, and I obviously want to work productively with people who do that. But it is still a real battle. We're faced with a battle, and we've got a lot of work to do.
Tony, thank you so much for your generosity today. It's been such an extraordinary honor for me to be the person to talk to you on everyone's behalf. So I can't thank you enough for that generosity. I want to also acknowledge the questions that have come in on the Q&A. I'm so sorry we won't have time to address those. There are a few other people to acknowledge in this session. A big thank you to my colleagues in the Melbourne Reconciliation Network, to my colleagues at the Faculty of Fine Arts and Music at the Willan Centre and in the Department of External Relations. And really a big thank you to everyone who's joined us on this Zoom today. And just so you know, there are people from all over the world who've logged into this talk, and we don't take it lightly that you join us for this event. So wherever you are, if you please join me in acknowledging our special guest, Tony Birch, and a big thank you to you all who made this possible, and especially to you, Tony. Thank you for this special event. All right, thank you, everyone.
Hey, can I just, before we go, I want to thank you, David. I also want to thank everyone for attending. So there was over 300 people, and that's remarkable to be able to speak to that many people. I feel really indebted, and I feel really humbled for that. I also want to thank our Auslan interpreters. They always do remarkable work. I've worked with Auslan interpreters, for many, many years now, and to allow a greater number of people to engage with what I'm doing because of that role, I think it's fantastic. So I want to thank them, and I just really hope that everyone, if you're in Victoria, please stay safe. Stick with it, we'll be fine. And for the rest of the people who are wandering around with great freedom, don't send me your photographs. I'll be so envious. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye now.
Bye.